So I'm so very honored to speak at this celebration of my colleague, my mentor, and my friend, Stephen Greenblatt. So I'll begin where we teach together at Harvard. World War II had ended, but signs still lingered at our university. Returning GIs doubled the incoming class, compelling the university to convert gymnasia into dorms. To signal its return to normalcy, Harvard revived the prestigious Norton Lectures, which had been suspended during the war. These public lectures were intended to treat poetry in the widest sense. Poetry meant poiesis, defined by Aristotle as the bringing forth of something new. To resuscitate these lectures, the university invited an unlikely speaker. The German Jewish émigré Erwin Panofsky was a towering figure in the field of art history. Steeped in classical learning, he had pioneered new approaches to meaning in the visual arts. Panofsky was a notoriously difficult writer, however, not the obvious choice for talks aimed at a general audience. But he rose to the occasion, taking as his topic the history of early Netherlandish painting. And here's the sort of thing he treated: Jan van Eyck's depiction of a patron in dialogue with the Virgin and Christ. Panofsky endeavored to explain the amazing poetry that made a painted wooden panel look like a slice of life. Panofsky also puzzled over one effect of this artistry. Miracles could be shown physically to occur, but now they had to look like events unfolding on our mundane side of the picture plane, and this caused problems for symbolism. Symbols, the lifeblood of Christian art, now had to be incorporated into the represented world. Christ atoned for the sin of Adam and Eve, so the artist smuggled our first parents in as a crafted element of the room's decor. Panofsky found such hidden symbols, and he interpreted them. This activity was, by his definition, humanistic. He examined certain records left behind by man, and he deciphered them as humane communiques. But at the close of his final lecture, he met his nemesis. Hieronymus Bosch was famously obscure already at his death in 1516, exactly 500 years ago this year. And this painter's work has baffled viewers ever since. The problems are fundamental. To say no consensus has been reached belies the animus that fuels the quest. For one erudite, this painter celebrates carnal pleasures. For his colleague in the audience, it damns the flesh. One recognizes a false utopia, another an alchemical tract, a third a Jewish marriage canopy, an Aztec calendar combined. Enmity finds no toehold on this carousel of love. For Panofsky, this dilemma had one cause. Originally, the work had a key. Now the key was lost, closing the work off from us. Faced with an artifact he couldn't, as it were, befriend, Panofsky closed his lectures with the words, "This too high for my wit, I prefer to omit." In the same year, 1947, another German art historian made it public. He had found the key. Wilhelm Franger had begun his search 5 years earlier while the Allies bombed his city to rubble. Now returned to decimated Berlin, Franger revealed his discovery. Now, Bosch's triptych resembled a triptych altarpiece, a Christian altarpiece, and scholars struggled to understand how this could be the case, given the display of nudity. Franger's solution was simple. The work was an altarpiece, but not a Christian one. It was the cult object of a bizarre sect which performed its orgiastic rites secretly in Bosch's hometown, here an 18th century fantasy of Adamites, and here how Franger thought Bosch's painting would have hung, enticing initiates to group sex in order to return by way of lawless copulation to paradise, to the innocence of Adam and Eve. Franger published his solution in a book titled Das Tausendjährige Reich. His publishers balked at the title because, in their words, this, quote, Nazi catchphrase could easily lead to errors, end quote. Also strange for a German in 1947, Franger proposed that the painting's mastermind had been a Jew, possibly a backsliding convert to Christianity. Franger arrived at this theory in 1944 and shared it with only one man. That man was Carl Schmitt, and in 1947 he sat in prison in Nuremberg awaiting possible prosecution for war crimes. He had been Germany's most brilliant and controversial jurist, and most famously the inventor of the idea that politics rests on a distinction between enemies and friends. While politics are ordinarily pursued within a legal order through debate and election, Schmitt argued that the legal order itself arises out of a life and death struggle with an enemy. In 1933, by arguing the legality of Hitler's seizure of power, he strove to become the juridical Führer of the Führer. After the war, Schmitt was taken into U.S. custody in Nuremberg. His defense? He didn't make Nazi law, he only interpreted it. Other questions were harder to evade. The first one, heading a questionnaire given to him upon his detainment, was, "Wer bist du?" Who are you? To which the Schmitt gave a torturous answer, penned in prison under the title The Wisdom of the Cell. Feeling himself naked before his captors, for whom he was the absolute enemy, a criminal against humanity potentially, Schmitt returned to the resources of his own thought. He translated the question, "Who are you?" into what was for him the a priori, "Who is my enemy?" To which the authoritarian jurist replied, "Self is the enemy. It is what seeks a new paradise in and through itself." And it is here that Bosch's masterpiece rose up as the very image of that enemy. Schmitt writes, "This is the true yearning of the I-crazy, this the new paradise, the Adamitic pleasure of the garden of delights that Hieronymus Bosch set down on panel in white nakedness." The Bosch that haunts Schmidt's cell is Franger's fantasy, a crypto-Jewish champion of carnal bliss. In 1946, Franger had sent Schmitt the typescript of Das Tausendjährige Reich. On the eve of his imprisonment, Schmitt was still sending Franger corrections. It's likely he brought the text with him to jail. But its findings were also known to Schmitt, since Franger had outlined them in 1944 in a letter to Schmitt. Franger felt indebted to Schmitt, having enlisted one of the jurist's doctoral students to troll the Dutch archives for Jews in Bosch's milieu. The timing is bizarre. The Nazi occupiers deported some 100,000 Jews from the Netherlands, of whom only about 5,000 would escape extermination. Franger admitted to Schmitt in 1944 that the search for Bosch's Jewish patrons was uncomfortable, unbequem. But he assured the anti-Semitic jurist that this sleuthing would yield great results. Franger also asked Schmitt to be his own eyes for him when, in 1944, the jurist was able to visit the Prado in Madrid and stare at what Franger termed the concentration point in Bosch. Now, Schmitt was right about one thing. Bosch is, in my view, an expert in enmity. Hatred was, so to speak, his professional speciality. At the beginning of a stage in European art when, due to an expanding art market, painters' shops narrowed their production to pictures of particular saleable types, portraits, landscapes, etc., Bosch made portraying enemies his trademark skill. The devil's hatred of people, people's hatred of people. The Jews' hatred of Christians, the reciprocal hatred of Christians for Jews, the murderous hostility between Islam and Christendom, the hatred directed towards an us by an invisible conspiring them, and the wrath of God that consumes just about everybody. This global economy of loathing stands not just portrayed in Bosch's pictures, it is performed in them, as if his brush were an instrument of enmity. Hatred contaminates. The aversions these images depict defiles how they act on us and how we react to them. Uncertain whether the image is for us or against us, we turn against each other. Bosch was buried on August 9th, 1516, and if his masterpiece ever had a key or even a title, the artist took them with him to his grave. However, Bosch also built his artwork to act like a time bomb to set and to detonate in any here and now. I wrote those words in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I'm reading them now at this festive gathering of Stephen's friends, and Bosch's revelers are still pursuing their pleasures on the grassy plain. Chaotic at the edges, their activities form a circle around the center, as if what drives them also binds them by a gravitational force. Time's arrow seems here to bend, until drawn into the circle, it can't escape. From the ceaseless present, Bosch directs a host of eyes towards us, focusing the image on us, allowing art to pass into life. So what happens in Eden that also is happening now in Bergen? It's an event never before imagined by a work of art. It's not yet the marriage of Adam and Eve, when God joins them hand in hand, and it's not yet even their meeting, when they rush towards each other in mutual attraction. No, this moment is the nanosecond after Eve's creation from Adam's rib, when Adam opens his eyes from sleep and first beholds his mate. A fleeting Augenblick, it is a momentous moment nonetheless. Divine creation now stands complete, and natural procreation takes over. Plants, animals, humans must seed themselves according to their kind. Here begins the story the Bible tells of trespass and expulsion, and afterwards of human history. Bosch tells what Stephen Greenblatt in his master class yesterday called an origin story. The artist urges us to think this way, that is, to read the scene as an episode within an origin story. Using the mobile structure of the triptych, he casts the creation scene on the triptych's outer shutters here as Act 1, implying that the inner ones are acts that follow, and in the right panel of that open state, he displays the story's grim conclusion. The scenes of hell make it hard not to read the triptych as showing left to right a beginning, a middle, and an end. So what happens? Adam gazes at Eve shamelessly, for as the Bible states, before the fall, quote, they were both naked and were not ashamed. Shameless, mesmerized looking is the only human action in Bosch's scene, save perhaps for the blood flushing Adam's cheeks. But what does looking do? To glimpse the disaster now occurring, we can follow the vector of Adam's gaze. The men rotating around the pool of women act out the desire that began with Adam's regard. This sight line passes through Eve's downcast eyes to what looks to be Eve again, now grabbed by the wrist. The couple in the pod enact another step before the visual vector reaches the counterclockwise circle. The circular dance in the central panel waylays time's error, and it captures our gaze just as Adam's eye was trapped by Eve. Bosch highlights Eve's trellises with gold paint, tresses with gold paint, so that the fascination the image portrays gets repeated in the fascination the image causes. And as in the beginning, so too at the end, the vector of sight terminates in a vortex. The tree man, Bosch's oblique self-portrait, looks rearward over his ruined body via the pleasures that ruined him back to Adam, whose features he shares. The world's catastrophe begins and ends and happens in the picture's present tense. Bosch collapses the origin of evil into the now of our experience of his painting. He rolls the Bible story back to a fleeting instant before the fall, when the only action was looking. And that is the disastrous action in which, of course, we are presently engaged. The picture puts us at the center, and at first this order seems to belong to the world that Bosch places on display, but this isn't the case. Fountain, pool, and parade align along the picture's central vertical axis, and the four surrounding formations, despite their capricious shapes, flank perfectly that center. Their symmetry receives support from outside, from the ensemble's triptych framework. Yet, on closer inspection, nothing is ordered in the painted world. The tips of those distant towers only look aligned, but they are in fact a protean object, consistent of crazy pinnacles, shimmering foliage, birds in flight. Theirs is an order located in the beholder, a symmetry at one with the tunnel vision of desire that trapped Adam and that traps me here and now in this fleeting moment of life. The brilliant colors of the central panel, unique in early Netherlandish painting, cause us to behold the world as if through idolatrous eyes. So Franger was right in that one respect. The triptych does resemble a sacred object. Bosch built it that way. He built it to look like the idol of an unspeakable cult. The false hypothesis of secret heresy reveals something true. The painting's target was never some foreign or forgotten other, however. Its target group was always us, whoever and whenever we are. Painter of enemies, Bosch shows us what it looks like to see through enemy eyes. Carl Schmitt's response was shaped by Franger, and thanks to Franger, he took Bosch's naked revelers to be Adamites, although he grasped them differently, not as friends, but as enemies. To the eyes of the authoritarian jurist, nothing is as loathsome and perilous as the idea that, unfettered by law, people make love, not war. A corollary of the modern secular doctrine that everything in the world is entirely a human affair, this was liberal democracy taken to its apocalyptic extreme. The state of the spirit, wrote Schmitt of Bosch's art, is more gruesome than the state of nature in Hobbes. In Schmitt's mind, assimilated Jews were the preacher of this idea. Wearing, quote, masks of demonic enigmaticness, end quote, they promised world peace, tempting Christians to deny inborn corruption and turn from God. Behind such dangerous sermons lay the old enemy, Satan, who whispered in Eden and whispers still, there are no enemies. The uncanny feature of Schmitt's prison epiphany is that he, of all people, should have got Bosch right. In December 1933, 9 months after Hitler assumed total power in Germany, the novelist Ernst Jünger wrote to Schmitt to congratulate him on a new edition of the book, The Concept of the Political. Noting that modern thought had concealed the true nature of the enemy, Jünger observed that to glimpse that idea as Schmitt alone had done, one needs to look closely at Bosch. In Bosch, enmity stands inscribed in the order of things. It creates a world divided by difference, evil against good, animal against human, us against them, all engaged in a cosmic battle that begins and ends with God's struggle with Satan. The strangeness of Bosch's pictures, concludes Jünger, derives from the fact that the friend-enemy distinction has become strange to us, end quote. As a soldier in World War I, Jünger had reveled in the experience of total mobilization, and in the 1930s he gave literary form to what he called the gripping spectacle of war in its pure gestalt, end quote. In Jünger's eyes, Bosch and Schmitt were the two unequaled portraitists of the enemy. Why then did Schmitt fail to see his own image in this painting? Schmitt insisted that the enemy is a concrete adversary intending to negate one's opponent's way of life. True, the enemy isn't exactly an objective category in that no third party observing the conflict from outside can properly grasp it. Quote, only the actual participants can know correctly, understand, and decide the concrete situation and settle the extreme case in conflict, end quote. The enemy is self-evident, but only to the combatants. Haunted by Bosch's painting, Schmidt's certitude falters. Pacing his own theories like the confines of his cell, he asks and re-asks the question, who is my enemy? Two lines of poetry come to mind. A sentence by the poet Theodor Deubler. Echoing Schmidt's writing throughout his career, this gnomic sentence allows the jurist to return to himself. The enemy is our own question as a figure, and he will hunt us and we him to the same end. Der Feind ist unsere eigene Frage als Gestalt, und wird uns, wir ihn, zu selben Ende hetzen. Our own question. This was the Nuremberg interrogators, who are you? It becomes here the enemy. And this makes the enemy peculiarly intimate, like a friend or a brother. The other is my brother, writes Schmitt. At the far end of his enemy painting, Bosch portrays the rearward-turned face of the self. Figure, or Gestalt in German, comes close to what Christian theology termed figura, something concrete and historical that through a likeness reveals something else that is also concrete and historical. Unlike the modern event, as something self-sufficient and secure, Figural understanding sees the event as at once concrete and concealed, a cloaked reality pointing beyond itself to the future battle between God and the devil. In May 1944, Schmitt spent several days in Lisbon in the company of Mircea Eliade, a philosopher of religion and a staunch supporter of Salazar's authoritarian rule in Portugal. Eliade had long conversations with Schmitt about Bosch. From these, Eliade concluded in his diary, quote, "The air raids help the Germans to understand Bosch and to discover or rediscover themselves in him," end quote. In Nuremberg, Schmitt saw himself in Bosch, but misrecognized it as his enemy. With Ernst Jünger, the recognition was more terrible. Sent to the Caucasian Front at the end of 1942, Jünger observed firsthand Goebbels' total war. Quote, "There are boundaries set for sight," Jünger observes, trying to look away. Unbeknownst to him, Soviet forces were surrounding Germany's doomed Sixth Army outside of Stalingrad. The climax of Jünger's own crisis occurred on Christmas Eve, as Jünger stood dangling midair in a goods cable lift above a deep ravine. While loudspeakers blasted Silent Night, Jünger looked down from his precarious perch onto scenes of unspeakable crimes. Then, like a veil over the acceptable, there arose the image. Jünger writes, "From an opening in the ruined tower, an officer yells at the soldiers manning the heavy artillery. As in Bosch, people peek out of empty eggs and strange machinery," end quote. With Bosch, art passes into life in the extreme case. That makes him a special challenge to the humanities. Quote, "I saw things that cross into the zoological," writes Jünger, unable just for once to turn life into art. Thank you.